Winter arrived early in that isolated stretch of Argentine Patagonia, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just takes over. Families reinforced doors, piled up firewood, adjusted chimneys so that the heat would rise quickly and dissipate before the smoke killed someone during the night. That's how it had always been. That's when Helena did the opposite. While the others prepared the roof, she opened up the floor of her own hut. She dug under the planks, diverted the chimney downwards, and began to conduct the heat into the earth, not into the sky, into the frozen ground. The neighbors stopped their animals to watch. Someone laughed. Another said it was a waste. A third person commented without lowering their voice that it wouldn't last more than a month. The cold weather didn't forgive mistakes there. A wrong decision in November meant missing out on spring. And as the wind began to harden the ground around them, Helena closed the floorboards, lit the fire, and he waited. What nobody knew was what was really being tested that winter. In that region of Patagonia, winter wasn't just a season. It was a filter. Those who didn't learn quickly didn't stay. The cabins were scattered far from each other, linked more by necessity than by real ties. Each family looked after its own survival, and that included carefully observing what others were doing, not out of curiosity, but to gauge risks. The rule was simple: don't innovate when the cold weather was approaching. They used what had worked before: straight chimney, constant fire, firewood piled as high as it would go. The heat rose, the smoke rose, and they hoped it would be enough. Helena had been living alone since last winter. She didn't talk much. She worked early, went to bed late. When her husband died, no one asked questions. Deaths happened there. Silence followed too. It was expected that she would sell the cabin, return to some less harsh place, or accept help that never came without cost. She did none of those things. He continued. He carried water. He chopped firewood. He fixed what broke. He asked for nothing. That in itself already set her apart from the norm. But what really caught our attention came weeks before the first major cold snap. When the ground was still hard, but not frozen. When there was still time, or so they said, she began to remove the floorboards. At first they thought it was a repair. Then, that she was slowly going mad. Each day more earth spilled out of the hut in makeshift carts. It wasn't a small hole, it wasn't shallow. She dug as if she had a plan but felt no need to explain it. Someone commented that she was tiring her body out before the wrong season. Another said that it would only fuel his own stubbornness. The older ones simply watched in silence, as if they had seen this type of mistake before. The judgment didn't come in speeches. It came in lingering glances, in short laughs when she passed by, in conversations that ceased as soon as she approached the communal well. Helena did not react. When the hole got deep enough, it started bringing up stones. Not decorative stones. Heavy, irregular stones ripped from the dry bed of a nearby river, one by one, day after day. Cracked hands, short breaths in the cold morning air. That's when they noticed the chimney. It didn't rise straight up like the others. Part of it disappeared beneath the floor. It went into the ground before rising again. A strange detour, clearly intentional. From that moment on, the comments ceased to be mere curiosity and became a certainty. The heat rises, someone said, as if teaching a child. She's going to use twice as much firewood, another one stated. When the cold weather hits, you'll regret it. No one spoke to Helena directly. It wasn't cruelty. It was emotional economy. In that place, you didn't get too involved with other people's mistakes. Each winter already had enough stories of those who tried something different and didn't survive. She finished the job a few days before the first sharp drop in temperature. He replaced the floorboards. He adjusted the chimney. He stacked the firewood as he always did, less than the others, which only reinforced the silent bets on how long it would last. On the first truly cold night, when the wind began to batter the walls intentionally, some glanced toward her cabin before closing their own doors. There was no excessive smoke. There was no different noise. Nothing indicated that anything was wrong. That's right. Helena lit the fire, sat down, and let the silence do its work. Winter had not yet revealed all that it intended to take away. The first week of cold weather was bearable, the kind of cold that still deceives you. The mornings required more firewood. The nights were long, but nobody panicked. It was during this period that mistakes began, because they seemed too small to matter. Helena burned less wood than usual. This did not go unnoticed. While the others kept the fire burning all day, feeding the flames at short intervals to prevent the air from cooling, Her cabin remained silent for hours. No constant smoke. No repetitive ritual of opening the stove door every so often. Someone commented that she was rationing too early. Another said it was just an appearance, that soon they would need to double their consumption. Nobody believed it was a choice. They thought it was a necessity. But there was a method. She lit the fire twice a day. Not low, not economical. It burned intensely. She let the heat build until the stones under the floor were laden with it. Then she closed everything up, let the fire die out on its own. She didn't touch it again. At night, while the others woke to refuel the stove, Helena remained lying down, not out of trust, out of observation. The floor beneath her feet still reflected warmth. The walls didn't sweat ice. The air didn't bite. It went against everything they taught there. From the beginning, heat was treated as something that needed to be kept in motion, to rise, to escape, to renew, never to stay, never to stop. Burying heat seemed as absurd as burying food before winter. That's what brought the laughter back. It's trying to warm the earth, someone said, shaking their head. When February arrives, you'll be burning furniture, another replied. No one can overcome the cold by hiding fire, a third person concluded. Helena listened. She always listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct. She didn't explain that heat didn't rise when it encountered mass, that the stone didn't compete with the fire. It only held it back, that their mistake wasn't technical, it was cultural, but she kept that to herself. The real risk wasn't using more firewood. It was time. The earth needed to be moved. The stones needed to learn the heat. In the first few days, some of the energy was lost. It was inevitable. If the cold became extreme too soon, the system wouldn't be ready. She knew that. Therefore, when the wind shifted and the signs began to appear, more restless animals, birds disappearing too early, nights that grew colder too quickly, she didn't speed up. She maintained her pace. She trusted the process. That was the part that nobody understood. It wasn't an impulsive gamble. It was active waiting, a silent calculation against something that couldn't be negotiated. On a particularly cold morning, Miguel, one of the neighbors, stood near her cabin for too long. He didn't go in. He just watched the chimney. The smoke rose cleanly. There was no excess smoke, there was no visible flaw. There's still time to close this deal, he said without provocation. The real winter hasn't arrived yet. Helena nodded. A brief gesture. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. When Miguel left, she went inside, closed the door, and put down another heavy load of firewood. Not because she needed it at that moment, but because she knew that when the real cold arrived, there would be no room for adjustments. The strange choice had already been made. Now all that remained was to find out if winter would accept it. The first test didn't come with violence. It came with consistency. Temperatures began to drop without dramatic warning, night after night, as if the cold was simply settling in. There was no storm. There was no emergency. Just harsher mornings and a different, heavier silence in the air. It was the kind of cold that exposes small flaws. In other cabins, the first problems appeared early. Doors that no longer closed properly began to let in drafts. Poorly fitted chimneys pulled smoke back inside. Green firewood, hastily stored, burned poorly and produced more smoke than heat. Nothing serious. Yet, Helena woke up before sunrise, as always. The difference was on the floor. Getting out of bed, she didn't feel the icy shock under her feet. The floorboards were warm, not hot. Warm enough not to remind her body that it was winter. He lit the fire out of habit, not out of urgency, and that started to attract attention. A neighbor commented by the well that her cabin seemed to hold out the night better than the others. Another said that perhaps it was an illusion, that the cold hadn't really set in yet. An older man observed that that kind of comment usually preceded trouble. Helena didn't join the conversation. In the third week, one early morning brought the first clear sign. The makeshift thermometer of one of the settlers registered a sharp drop. It wasn't a record, but it was enough to force adjustments. Families began waking up in the middle of the night to tend the fire. Those who overslept paid the price with walls covered in thin ice on the inside. In Helena's cabin, the fire had been left to die out hours before. Still, the air remained still. The heat didn't come from a visible point. It didn't radiate from a flame. It was simply there, coming from below, slow, unhurried. This did not mean absolute comfort. She felt the chill in the corners. She knew that if she messed up the rhythm, she would lose everything in a few days. That's why she maintained her discipline. Strong fire, long intervals, constant observation. It was during this period that he made his first mistake. One night, when the wind changed direction, Helena miscalculated the time. He let the fire go out too soon. He didn't realize that the previous charge hadn't been enough to fully recharge the stones. The cold didn't enter immediately, but began to seep in slowly, almost imperceptibly. At dawn, the ground no longer reflected heat as it once did. She made the adjustment without dramatizing. She increased the intensity of the burn that night. She stayed awake longer, sitting near the stove, listening to the sound of the wood giving way. There was no panic, just adjustment. Meanwhile, in other homes, firewood consumption was increasing. Gradually, the difference began to weigh on them. Those who burned all day had less rest, less time, less leeway. The cold was still polite, but it demanded constant attention. A child fell ill on the edge of the settlement. Tomas, the son of a newly arrived couple. Nothing serious. A cough, a low fever. Even so, it was enough to change the tone of the conversations. Winter always demanded its first warnings like this. Someone mentioned in a low voice that Helena's cabin seemed to hold up better, not as a compliment, out of uncomfortable curiosity. "It's still early," another replied. "Wait until January." She heard this as she walked by carrying water. That night, he felt the heat rise through the planks again, steady, constant. The stones had learned. The system was beginning to behave as it should. It wasn't the final test yet, but it was no longer luck. Helena allowed herself to sleep a little longer. Outside, the cold continued to descend, degree by degree, preparing for something bigger. And unbeknownst to them, everyone was entering the part of winter where there would be no room for minor adjustments. The mistake didn't originate with her first. It came with the winter. The cold changed its nature in a single night. It didn't descend in stages. It fell all at once. The kind of fall that doesn't respect predictions or ancient signs. The wind started before sunset and didn't stop. It pushed the icy air against the cabins as if testing every crack, every decision made months before. The following morning, the settlement awoke to a different feeling. Doors jammed, frozen water in buckets, the dry sound of wood creaking under contraction. The cold had ceased to be a constant annoyance and had become a direct threat. Helena woke up with the floor still warm, not as hot as in previous days. Just enough. That should have been a warning. But the system was working, and the quiet confidence that had been building almost made her repeat the pattern without adjustments. Almost. She noticed something strange as she approached the stove. The draft was slower. The air was behaving differently. The strong wind was altering the pressure in the chimney, and the heat was taking longer to travel through the underground passage. It was a small detail, invisible to anyone who hadn't spent weeks watching the same fire. Helena corrected it too late. That night the cold narrowly won. It didn't enter like a rush, it seeped in. The stones weren't heavily laden to sustain the entire night. Near dawn, the heat began to subside. The walls grew cold to the touch. The floor lost the slow comfort it had been providing. She woke up before sunrise, feeling her body react. He didn't panic. He rekindled the strong fire, as always. But the delay cost him a few hours of discomfort that shouldn't have happened. That was enough to remind her of something essential. That system didn't forgive carelessness. There was no room for emotional scrutiny there, only physical scrutiny. While Helena was correcting her own mistake, something worse was happening on the other side of the settlement. Tomas fell ill during the night. It wasn't immediate. First the cough, then the shortness of breath, the kind of sound that doesn't go with sleep. The mother tried to keep the boy near the stove, but the heat rose too quickly and was lost before reaching the makeshift mattress. The father went out twice to fetch more firewood. The second time he returned with his fingers too stiff to hold the door properly. When day broke, Tomas was already having difficulty breathing. The cold had entered his lungs. The news spread quietly. There was no time for drama, just quick actions and accumulated failures. Some women offered to help. Other men promised more firewood. Nothing solved the central problem. The heat wouldn't last. It was then that someone mentioned Helena's cabin, not as a suggestion, as a last resort. "It looks different inside," someone said, avoiding looking directly at them. The floor, I don't know how to explain it. The decision was made in silence. When there was a knock at her door, the wind was still blowing strongly. Helena opened it without asking why. Clara's face, Tomas's mother, said it all. The boy was wrapped in damp blankets, his lips too pale for someone so young. Helena did not hesitate. He helped lay the child down in the warmest spot in the hut, not near the fire, on top of the stones. He removed the cold layers, replaced them with dry ones, and waited. The effect wasn't immediate, but it was consistent. Breathing began to slow. The harsh sound gave way to something deeper, less strained. The body stopped fighting against its surroundings. Nobody said anything. The father Esteban stood there, unsure where to put his hands. Clara sat on the ground, feeling the heat rise up her legs like something that didn't exist anywhere else in that valley. Helena kept the fire steady, without overdoing it, without extinguishing it. The child fell asleep. It was there, in that heavy silence, that Winter lost something important. Not force, authority. Because everyone there understood that it wasn't luck. It wasn't magic either. It was preparation, observation, a choice made while there was still time, and corrected quickly enough to avoid becoming a complete tragedy. Outside, the wind continued, but inside the cabin the mistake had been contained, and Winter, for the first time, did not take everything it came for. The cold didn't recede after that night. It did the opposite. As if sensing resistance, he began to persist. Days went by without sun. Constant wind, changing direction, pressing against chimneys, sucking heat from wherever it could still be extracted. It was no longer a sudden drop. It was continuous wear and tear. That was how Winter truly won. In the other cabins, routine turned into exhaustion. The fire could never die out. Sleep became a series of interrupted naps. Every hour without firewood was a risk. Each night outing cost sensitivity in the fingers, sometimes more. The firewood started to go down too fast. Some realized too late that they had miscalculated. Others knew from the beginning but trusted that the winter would be shorter. It wasn't. The cold settled in, as if it intended to stay. In Helena's cabin, the behavior was different. There was no rush. There was no hurry. The fire was lit at almost fixed times, burning brightly for controlled periods. Then silence. The heat remained, spread out, without a single point of dependence. Now the ground was consistently hot. Not to the touch immediately, but present. A warmth that didn't attack the body, only prevented it from losing energy. The kind of warmth that doesn't draw attention until you leave it. Helena knew this was the crucial phase. The system was already charged. The stones had accumulated days of energy. Now the challenge was to maintain balance under prolonged pressure. And then came the real warning. An even more severe cold front was approaching. The kind that knocks down animals, breaks young trees, and makes experienced men recalculate everything. It didn't arrive with an immediate storm. It arrived in silence and with an excessively clear sky. That night, the stars seemed close. The air was cutting through. Helena increased the fire load, not out of fear, but because of her reading. She adjusted the draft. He ensured the underground flow was clear. She spent the night awake longer, sitting, listening to the sounds that only an attentive person recognizes. At dawn, the cold was at a level that no one there had experienced in recent years. On the other side of the settlement, 2 huts already had serious problems. In one, the chimney lost draft due to the headwind, and the smoke began to back up. In another, the firewood simply no longer produced enough heat. The fire existed, but it couldn't overcome the environment. People started to move, not as visitors, as survivors. First, a small family arrived, then another. They didn't ask for explanations. They only inquired if there was space. Helena nodded. She adjusted the stove. She didn't comment on the consumption. She didn't impose limits. The cabin, built for a select few, came to house many. The heat hasn't subsided. That was what scared those who went in the most. It wasn't just the air. It was the floor, the walls, the feeling that the cold couldn't cling to anything inside. The children sat on the floor. The adults took off their gloves without realizing it. Helena watched everything in silence. I knew that was the point where systems fail. Not when everything goes as planned, but when they are pushed beyond what was planned. More bodies, more humidity, more doors opening and closing, more potential errors. She adjusted it again. Minor details. Another strong charge at the right time. Fewer unnecessary interventions. The fire worked for the stones, not for the air. It was a long night. Outside, the cold reached levels that made simple decisions dangerous. Inside, the temperature dropped slightly, but remained stable. No surfaces froze. No breath turned to smoke. It was there that something definitively changed. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody commented. No one explained it. People just felt it. Winter had done its best to avoid an open storm, and yet it had lost to something that made no noise, did not shine, did not rise in flames. In the morning, when the cold was still biting, someone said in a low voice, almost to themselves, "It's not the fire, it's the ground." Helena did not answer. It wasn't necessary. The greatest test had not been winning a single night. It had been supporting many for days, with less than others spent to survive on their own. Winter continued outside, but at that point, he was no longer in control. The request did not come in the form of an apology. It came about out of necessity. The morning after the coldest night yet, one of the men who had laughed weeks before appeared at her door. Ramiro. He didn't knock loudly. He didn't announce his presence. He just stood there waiting to be noticed, like someone who had already decided to swallow his pride before even crossing the threshold. Behind him, his wife, Lucia, held a bundle. It wasn't firewood. It was a baby. Helena opened the door expressionlessly. The wind tried to come in with her but lost strength as soon as it crossed the edge of the cabin. The contrast was immediate. Ramiro stopped for a second, feeling his body react to the heat coming from below, not from the fire. "It was a tough night," he said, without accusation, without justification. "We can't keep the house warm." Helena nodded. A simple gesture. She made room. He didn't ask what had been said before. He didn't remember laughing. He didn't mention silent bedding. The child was placed on a pile of blankets directly above the warmest area of the floor. The crying gradually subsided, not for emotional comfort, but because the body stopped expending energy trying to warm itself. Others came, one by one. Some who had never spoken to Helena beyond what was necessary. Others who had commented, aloud, that it was all just buried stubbornness. Now they weren't saying anything. They sat. They observed. They felt. Silence filled the cabin, not out of embarrassment but as belated recognition. No one asked technical questions. No one demanded lengthy explanations. They simply looked at the floor, touched the planks, trying to understand how something so simple had gone unnoticed for so long. One of the oldest, Don Ezekiel, who had survived more winters than he liked to count, sat down directly on the floor and remained there, motionless, for minutes. Then he simply said, "This is nothing new." Helena nodded in confirmation. He didn't explain where it came from. He didn't talk about origins, memory, or ancient learning. He simply kept the fire at the right pace. The real reversal wasn't in the help. It was in the attitude. Helena did not become the center of attention. He gave no orders. He did not assume formal leadership. She remained the same quiet person, just necessary. When someone asked if that could be done in other cabins, she answered briefly. She said enough not to be misunderstood, but no more than that. She conveyed depth. She conveyed care. She indicated that mistakes there would be costly. The men who were once certain were now listening, not because Helena spoke better, but because the cold had taught them. That night, no one went out. The wind picked up again, and the cold remained relentless. But inside the cabin, the system absorbed yet another human burden without collapsing. The fire worked. The stones responded. The warmth remained. At some point, someone noticed that Helena was sleeping, not watching, not controlling everything, sleeping. This sealed something that didn't need to be said. When the cold began to slowly subside a few days later, people started returning to their homes. Not all at once. Carefully, with fresh eyes. Some returned only during the day, to observe how the cabin behaved without so many people. Helena did not stop it. When they were alone again, nothing was said. But something had been permanently rearranged. Those who laughed are now measuring their words. Those who doubted now observed before judging. And anyone who had seen a child breathe better because of a warm floor needed no further proof. Redemption did not come with applause. He came in silence. It came in contained requests. It came as a belated act of respect. And that was enough. Winter didn't end all at once. It receded gradually, like someone who lost an argument but won't admit it. The nights remained cold for weeks, but they no longer had the same intensity. The cold was still there, but it no longer dictated the decisions. When the families finally returned to their cabins, they took something invisible with them. It wasn't just the memory of the warmth. It was the shattering of an old certainty. Some began digging even before the ground had completely softened. Not deeply. Not yet. First, they observed. They measured. They tried to understand what they had ignored for so long. Others waited but began to ask more questions. Fewer jokes, fewer ready-made certainties. Helena did not become an official reference. No one called her an expert. Nobody asked him to lead anything. But men who had never asked for advice before began to show up with questions that were too specific to be mere casual curiosity. How deep? What type of stone? How long to burn? What to look for when something didn't seem right? Helena answered without enthusiasm, without pride, without secrecy. He said what needed to be said. He warned about mistakes. He kept repeating that it wasn't something to rush. When spring finally loosened the earth, 2 huts began actual digging. A third waited a little longer. An older man said he preferred to err slowly than to die quickly. The following winter was not as severe. Nevertheless, the difference became apparent. Where the fire once never stopped, now there were intervals. Where the firewood ran out sooner than expected, now there was plenty. Not absolute comfort, that was still a luxury, but stability. The kind of stability that allows you to sleep without waking up in a panic. Helena continued living as she always had. He didn't expand the cabin. He didn't build anything new. He didn't talk about what he had done as something extraordinary. The only real change was that no one spoke of her as eccentric anymore. They spoke of her as someone mentioning a geographical landmark, something that exists and works. Years later, when outsiders passed through the region, they noticed something strange. Some cabins had thicker floors, chimneys that disappeared into the ground before rising. It wasn't standard, but it wasn't an accident either. When asked, the answers were vague. It works better this way. We learned our lesson during a bad winter. Helena's name appeared infrequently, but the method remained. When she left the cabin much later, she showed the system to whoever would stay. She explained the rhythm. She warned against negligence. She said that the ground did not forgive carelessness but rewarded attention. Then he left. The cabin changed hands. Someone tried to simplify the system. It didn't work so well. Another kept it as it was. It worked. Time passed. New solutions emerged. Others easier, faster, less silent. But under some houses, the ground was still different. Stones that had learned to store heat did not forget it so easily. And even when the system was covered up, ignored, treated as old, excessive work, it remained there, waiting, like everything that works without needing to be seen. The legacy was not a revolutionary technique. It was a correction of arrogance, a practical reminder that sometimes what seems strange is simply too old to be recognized. The cold took away nights of sleep, wood, old certainties. It took away the easy comfort of those who believed that surviving was simply repeating what had always been done. But it didn't take everything. Beneath a simple hut, stones silently held warmth. They didn't ask for credit. They didn't announce any efficiency. They simply did what they needed to do when it mattered most. Stories like these rarely become visible. They don't shout. They don't teach aloud. They remain buried, waiting for someone to pay attention when easy solutions fail. Because when winter truly comes, it's not the one who speaks best who wins. Victory belongs to whoever understands what the cold still respects. If this story has kept you silent until now, continue. Subscribe and watch the next one. There are still others that time almost managed to bury.